Hi, my name is Beth and I'm the sewing pattern designer and blogger at Sew DIY. This month I'm celebrating my Miri Tank top pattern with a brand new video sew along. The Miri Tank top is a woven tank top designed for beginners. It comes with a scoop neck and a V-neck. And the pattern includes sizes 0 to 32 with 3 cup size options for all sizes. I've already done a video about choosing your size and I'll make sure to link that down below. Last week we sewed the shoulder seams, center back seams, and the darts, and today we're going to sew the all-in-one facing. This facing finishes the neckline and the armholes, and it's done in the burrito style, so it makes a really clean finish and there's no top stitching required. In this video, I'm sewing the scoop neck version, but I also have a video about sewing the all-in-one facing with the V-neck, and I'll link to that up here. Learning how to sew a facing is going to teach you a lot of really great basic sewing skills. You get to learn about interfacing, which we did last time, things like matching up notches, sewing a seam, clipping and grading a seam, and understitching a seam. It's all really great stuff that you can take to a lot of other projects. I really love this all-in-one facing treatment because it's such a clean finish, and the burrito method of rolling it up and sewing feels really magical and fun. Let's get started. So in the last video, we assembled our facing piece. We sewed the shoulder seams there, and in our front and back, we sewed the shoulder seams and the center back seam. I have the main bodice front and back sitting with my neck hole opening here, right side up. Then I'll put my facing down wrong side up so the right sides are together. And I need to pin the necklines together. So the easiest way to start is by lining up the shoulder seams and just go around and match the notches and the shoulder seams and the center back seam. So first we want to pin the neck opening. And when you pin it together, you can line up the shoulder seams. The center of the back facing will match the center back seam, and there are also notches in the back neck. If you need a little help matching up the front section, you can fold these pieces in half to mark the center front and match that point. I've gone ahead and put a bunch of pins in, and then I will stitch around with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Just stitch carefully all the way around. I usually start at one of the shoulder seams, but it doesn't matter where you start. As you stitch around the curve, you may need to lift your presser foot a little bit. Just be careful not to pivot too much and create an angle. As you approach the spot where you began, try to line up your stitching so that it overlaps. Then you can do a little back stitch and cut the threads. After stitching all the way around, look at both sides and make sure that the stitching is even and that none of the seam allowances have gotten turned over or wrinkled. Make sure that you haven't caught any fabric that you don't want to, and you can redo any bits that don't look right. Now's the time to do it. So we have sewn this neckline, gotten it all fixed up if necessary, but we're not done with this yet. We need to flip the facing to the wrong side, and we want it to be invisible, and we want this curve to be nice and flat. And there are a few things we're going to do now to help that. We're going to grade and clip the seam allowance. So grading means that we trim down the seam allowance, and we're going to have one seam allowance shorter than the other. And this will create a smoother bump underneath the fabric. Next, we're going to clip the curve, and that means we just make little cuts in the seam allowance. And this will help the seam allowance curve to the other side and curve outward, because right now it's facing inward and it's smaller than this exterior part of the curve. So we need to make little clips so it can turn under and spread out like a fan. So I mainly use these two scissors. These are like micro tip thread snips. I love them. They are my favorite tool, and I would be lost without them. So I like these because I can get really close to the seam line but not cut through it. So you can see here, we're going to create a little fan. And the more curve there is, the more clips you'll want to make. So you want to focus the clips on this front part of the curve and this back neck. This part is straight, so we don't need as many. This part's a little bit curved. Either before or after you clip the curve, you want to grade the seam allowance. And I generally use my regular fabric scissors. I've also seen people recommend these duckbill, I think they're applique scissors, because this duckbill part protects the other part of the fabric. I don't like them as much because it's a shorter blade and it takes longer for me. So I just use these big, long guys. And then I think it's also more even. My duckbill cutting is pretty wonky. So I will cut down the facing, that's the part with the interfacing, to about 1/4 inch. And you do that all the way around. Then I cut the fabric to about 3/8 of an inch. So you can see there's a little staggered line there. Yeah, the order of how you cut things is really personal preference. You could cut both seam allowances down to 3/8 and then trim the facing a little bit more. I would do whatever works best for you. You may also find that you like to grade and then clip. You know, if you clip first, you get all these little tiny pieces. Functionally, it's the same either way. And then you want to be really careful that you don't accidentally cut your shirt, that you're only cutting the seam allowance. Here's my neckline clipped and graded, and I am going to press it before I understitch. Some people don't press at this point, but I like it. I like to do it because it's kind of an extra insurance. I also like to keep my little scissors on hand because as I'm pressing, I can kind of check, see if I have clipped enough and if there are any points where maybe it's not turning as nicely as I want. So if you have one, I also recommend using a tailor's ham. If you don't have one, you could roll up a big towel, and this will help us press this a little easier. Our neckline is not going to lay flat because our shoulders have an angle to them. So this will just help us get it a little flatter as we press. So I often do a press just right on top to kind of lock in the stitches. I think this is a common quilting technique. At least that's where I learned it. When we understitch, we're going to flip our facing towards our seam allowance. So push it up. And then we're going to stitch on top of the facing and stitch it to the seam allowance. The understitching will help keep the seam allowance and the facing on the inside of the top. And this is stitching that you won't see from the outside. You may find it easier to press from the wrong side of the fabric because you'll be able to see that seam allowance and make sure you're getting all those little clipped bits pressed towards the facing. So just go around, give it a little press, and then we'll take it to the sewing machine. I'm using a straight stitch, and because this is just kind of a basting seam to hold stuff together, I use a 3.0 length, so just a little bit longer. I like to understitch with the wrong side up because I feel like I have a little bit more control. And I actually have a full video that's all about understitching here on YouTube, so you can go check that out if you want more details. So I am going to be stitching on top of the seam allowance and going through the facing, but I am not going to be stitching through the outside of my top because we don't want this to be visible from the right side. And I'm stitching really very close to the seam line, maybe just a 1/16 of an inch or an 1/8 of an inch away. And as you stitch, you can use your fingers to push that seam allowance towards the facing. Just use your fingers to make everything as flat as possible. Doing the understitching can feel a little bit awkward because you have all these curves, all these pieces of fabric, but don't stress about it too much. It's not going to be visible from the outside. And the most important thing is that you just don't catch the top in your stitching, but if you do, you can always undo the stitches. All right, I've understitched all the way around the neckline, and you can see this little line of stitching on the facing, but if you flip it to the right side, you can't see it at all. So I'm going to go ahead and press, just double check that nothing wonky happened while I was stitching. This is where you can shift things into place, and we want to get a nice fold for the right side of the fabric. So just give it a nice press all the way around, and we are ready to stitch an armhole. Now we're going to sew the facing to the armholes, and we'll use the burrito method so that everything gets rolled up and enclosed really nice and clean. So you want to lay down your top with the facing up, and then on one side, roll your top towards the other side. And we are going to stitch this side of the facing to the armhole. Right now it's wrong sides together though, so we need to get it right sides together. And we're going to do that by wrapping it around to the other side. This is our burrito. So I think I'll start with the middle, wrap this around, and then match that shoulder seam. So you'll definitely want some pins. Then again, wrapping around, and I get this side seam. And then I recommend looking for the notches and matching those. And if you need to, you can push down the other part of the top out of the way. Let's do this other one. And on the back, there are 2 notches. So we know we have it going the right way. And then I'm just going to add more pins along here and take it over to the sewing machine. I'm stitching the seam with a straight stitch at a regular length and a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. You'll also want to backstitch at the beginning and end. As you go around the curves of the armhole, take it slowly and adjust as needed. If you're sewing view B, you'll pivot at the corners, and I have another video that shows view B. I'll link that here and in the show notes. All right, here's my seam all stitched. I recommend taking a look, making sure that you didn't catch anything in the seam that you didn't want to. Now we're going to repeat the process that we did for the neckline and clip, braid, and understitch. Here's that armhole all braided and clipped, and now we want to turn this right side out. So just carefully put your hand inside the shoulder and pull. Okay, so here we have our armhole right side out. You can see that the facing is encompassing both the neckline and the armhole. And I'm going to press this armhole and then understitch it. To understitch this armhole, we're going to start at one of the side seams and then stitch as far as we can go. You want to have the seam allowance pushed towards the facing and then stitch through the seam allowance and the facing, just like we did with the neckline. Okay, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky. As we're getting up into this armhole, we'll just go as far as we can, and you can use your fingers to move the fabric out of the way so that you're only stitching the seam allowance and the facing. Then we want to go to the other side of the armhole and understitch that side. Understitch as far as you can towards the shoulder and then press the seam flat. This armhole is sewn and the edges of the facing are all enclosed on the inside now, and we need to sew this side. So we're going to do the same process that we did for this side. We're going to roll this up And then flip the facing around so that we have right sides together. And let's start with the shoulder seam and pin this together. Next, wrap the end of the facing around the tank top so that the right sides are together and the side seams are aligned. And repeat for the other side. Then you'll match the notches and pin all the raw edges together. This armhole might feel a little bulkier when you're sewing it together because that other side has been sewn. So just take your time and be careful. You can push this fabric back away from the cut edge and use as many pins as you need to hold these raw edges together. Because it's all rolled up, sometimes this fabric will be really bulky inside there. This is a pretty lightweight fabric, but you'll have a little more tension on the fabric trying to pull these pieces apart. So don't be afraid to use a lot of pins. Now we'll sew the second armhole. It's just the same as the last one. Here's this final armhole all stitched, and now we're going to braid and clip again. I have stitched our second armhole, I have clipped and braided the seam allowance, and now we can turn it right side out. I think this is the most fun part of this project, and it still feels magical to me. I somehow can't wrap my head around how this actually works, but it does, and you have to trust the process. So just reach in and gently pull. We don't want to rip our top before we even finish it. And look, there we are. Okay, so I just need to press this seam and then I'm going to understitch it the same way I did for the other side. And that's everything we're doing today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you don't have your own copy of the pattern yet, there's a link down in the show notes. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future videos. In the final segment of sewing the tank top, we will sew the side seams and the hem. I hope you'll join me. Make sure to subscribe and hit the little bell to be notified of future videos. Happy sewing!